So good evening, everyone. We're going to get started here in a couple of minutes. So please grab some food and your drink, and we'll get rolling. Well, that was impressive. I usually can't quiet a class like that. Thank you all for being here, and welcome. Good evening. I'll just note, we also have folks online, so we're doing everything on microphones, including questions when we get to that. But I'm Paul Teske. I'm the Dean of the School of Public Affairs here at University of Colorado, Denver. And we are so excited and delighted that you're here for the first annual Mary E. Guy Distinguished Lecture Series, which will be an annual event thanks to the generous philanthropy of Dr. Guy. And we have a wonderful speaker here tonight, Dr. Susan Gooden, who's a leading expert on social equity issues, also the Dean of the L. Douglas Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond. And I have a little more to say about Susan's background in a minute before she starts her lecture. But before we dive into that, I do want to really acknowledge Mary Guy's vision and philanthropic generosity that made this event possible. Mary's been a SPA faculty member since 2008. She's dedicated to advancing the causes of public service, public administration, social equity. As a scholar, we have a lot of awards in our field, and it's an amazing thing if you win one of them. She's won like almost all of them in the last several years. She's also one of the few CU, University of Colorado Distinguished Professors. And many of you in the room are current PhD students, past PhD students know she's an amazing mentor to our graduate students, has educated and fostered a whole generation of wonderful scholars in this field. So her commitment to fostering positive change through education is really at the core of the spirit of this event and this lecture. So Mary, I want to thank you so much for everything you've done. We have a very distinguished crowd here and online tonight. I want to mention a couple of folks. Our Interim Chancellor Ann Schmiesing is with us, and we're delighted that she's here. Executive Vice Chancellor Ann Sherman is here. I'll probably screw up some of these titles. Our Vice Chancellor for Advancement, Melissa Baldwin. I saw Tehran here before. I'm probably missing lots of important folks, so I apologize. And I do want to mention Richard Stillman in the back, who's chatting with Christine, retired SPA faculty member, huge pillar in the field. Some of you probably used his textbook on cases in public administration, which prior to Mary and Todd's book being used all over the country, was the staple. So we've had a lot of influence in that domain. A few quick logistic notes. There's bathrooms around the corner, obviously food in back. Please help yourself. We're expecting to run till about 7 tonight, but if you have to leave earlier, we understand, and we don't get kicked out at 7. So if you want to keep eating and having the conversations, please do that as well. The food is provided by Gourmet Ghost Charcuterie, a locally owned Colorado small business. We try to use caterers in that, so we want to thank them very much. You probably noticed with the scrolling PowerPoints that we do a land acknowledgement here at CU Denver. And I think especially relevant to tonight's topic, this was the native land of the Ute, Arapaho, Cheyenne, and other tribes. And our campus itself was an urban development project that partially tore down a working class Latino neighborhood, Hispanic neighborhood. And we acknowledge that history, we honor it, we try to do what we can about it at this point. So that's an important part of our legacy. After Dr. Gooden talks this evening, we'll take some questions. There's 3x5 cards that hopefully you've seen around. And if you could write down your questions, and then I'll gather those and moderate those. Again, doing that by microphone so that the folks online can hear, and also that allows the folks online to send some questions in by chat if they would like to do that. So I think the selection committee, which is I think mostly in this room for this distinguished lecture, Todd Ely, Xu Yangpeng, and Felipe Blanco made an amazing choice in Dr. Susan Gooden, and it's really set a high bar that we're going to have trouble matching, I think, in future years. She's an internationally recognized scholar focusing on social equity, public policy, and the intersection of race and governance. Her degrees, she has an associate degree from Patrick and Henry Community College, and we were talking today about sharing the campus with the Denver Community College, and she's a big community college advocate, so that's great. She has MA and MS degrees from Virginia Tech, and her Ph.D. from the Maxwell School at Syracuse University, which I believe turned 100 years old this year, which is pretty remarkable. At SPA, we're 51, I think. So, and I think the Maxwell School is the oldest in the country at 100. So, a wonderful institution. Susan is an elected fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration. She's held leadership roles in lots of national organizations, including as past president of the American Society for Public Administration. She has lots and lots of publications. I could go on here for 10 or 15 minutes. I won't do that, but her recent book, Racial Equity, COVID-19 and Public Policy, The Triple Pandemic, demonstrates her commitment to advancing social equity in public administration. She also wrote a book in 2015 called Race and Social Equity, a Nervous Area of Government. And I think 2015 was kind of before the social equity topic was as important or appreciated or cool as it is now. And so it was really path-breaking work. And so she's just done a tremendous amount in this field, both in scholarship, in carrying out, in actual education practice, and through the field of public administration. Her talk tonight is titled The Future of Social Equity. So please, without further ado, join me in welcoming our first Mary E. Guy Distinguished Lecturer, Dr. Susan Gooden.
Well, good evening, everyone, and it is indeed an honor to be here with you this evening. And when Dean Teskey said when social equity wasn't as cool as it was, I've heard social equity called a lot of things recently. Cool, I haven't heard as much. So I know I'm in the right place here at the University of Colorado at Denver. I want to start by also acknowledging my thanks to many in the room, and it's always a challenge when you start naming names because you leave people out, but there are a few people I just feel like I have to recognize. First, I want to say thank you to the Chancellor for being here today, Chancellor Schimming. I really appreciate you being here. Dean Teskey, thank you for the invitation, for all the hospitality of your staff from Dee Dee and Chris. It's just made it a very warm and welcoming experience. It's also great to see Richard Stillman here. I had dinner with him last night. It's great. Thank you so much, Richard, for your support. And then three former students that are here that we share in common. Felipe Blanco, who I was on his dissertation committee, and I know he's doing wonderful things here and at the School of Public Affairs. I think you've made an excellent hire there. Samantha Larson, who also served as an external member of her dissertation committee, and I know she's an alum, so thank you, Sam, for being here. And then just maybe 10 minutes ago, a young lady, Keisha Allen Homer, came up to me and she was like, you may not remember me, but I'm a CPAP student. And when she said CPAP, that was my first job at Virginia Tech, the Center for Public Administration and Policy. And she actually grew up in my husband's hometown, which is Buckingham, Virginia. It was a very, very small town. And she spent her early years there. So it has been a very, very warm welcome. Indeed, it's been a bookends experience, and I appreciate the opportunity. And I also want to thank the selection committee for entrusting me to serve in this capacity. And indeed, it is an honor. So to kick off, I also want to provide my acknowledgments and respect to Mary Ellen Guy. And, you have a true jewel here. I know I'm not telling you anything that you don't know, but oftentimes you can't be a prophet in your own land. So let me say, Mary is tremendously respected in the field of public administration. She has done Herculean work, and many folks, including myself, stand on her shoulders for the opportunities that she has provided, whether it's through SWAPA, the Section on Women in Public Administration, which she's been a diehard dynamo, whether it has been through all of her work on dissertation committees and the work that she has done in supporting students, whether it's through her work in ASPA as a former ASPA president herself, or in NAPA, or as a co-editor of the inaugural co-editor of the Journal of Social Equity and Public Administration. Mary has done a wonderful, wonderful job, and she really, really represents you extremely, extremely well in a national context. So please join me in giving Mary a warm round of applause. So I thought no place better to start this lecture than to start it with our namesake, and that's Mary Ellen Guy. So when I was thinking about this, I thought about her book, PA Evolving. And that's just one of many books, of course, that Mary has written, but she co-edited that book with Mary Ellen Rubin. And it was called From Foundations to the Future. And that book was done at the 75th anniversary of Public Administration Review and ASPA, of a 75th anniversary of ASPA. And she did this book, and it had a foreword by Richard Stillman, a great foreword there. And they commissioned a wide range of authors, and I was honored to be included in one of them, to examine 75 years of our field, both theoretically and practically. And so some of the chapters included From Trust to Doubt, from local to global, from paper to cloud. And so the chapter that I wrote was From Equality to Equity. And so I thought I would concentrate my remarks tonight on the future of social equity, looking back at that chapter. That book came out in 2015. And so I know it's amazing, but almost 10 years have passed now. And so I thought this was a good place to sort of launch a talk about the future of social equity, to revisit that and to think about how I would update that in thinking about the future of social equity today. But of course, before we can understand the future, we have to look to the past. And so I organized that chapter around 5 key questions. And the 6th question is a new question that I added, and I'll go through each of these in turn to talk a little bit about how we have evolved as a field in terms of public administration and our understanding of equity and where we may be going from here. So let's look back a little bit first. So the first question that I'll outline is, what is the context for equality? And so this is pre-1960s. And so really thinking about equity and the concept of equality firmly being grounded in democratic principles. So we thought about our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, these so-called self-evident truths that have not really been true relative to implementation, about all people or all men at the time being created equal. There was a huge gulf between our principles and their implementation. So we excluded, for example, the first Americans. We excluded women. We excluded Blacks. It took nearly 100 years, and in some cases over 100 years later, before we passed the 13th, 14th, 15th, and 19th Amendments, to begin to bridge that gap between our democratic principles that we all feel so proud about, and recognizing the vast gulf that existed in terms of their implementation. Thomas Jefferson, who is another Virginian, who of course is interesting in his own right. But one of the things that Thomas Jefferson said that I think was important, reflecting upon as a founding father, that it was important to understand what they supported, but also what they intentionally rejected. And there was an intentional rejection of full equality by our founding fathers. And by that, we continue then to try to fill that gap. And that's the work of equity. I also think it's important to acknowledge someone, Frances Harriet Williams, who is a little less well known in terms of her work that she did to advance social equity. So Frances Harriet Williams worked in the Office of Price Administration. This is a photo that I was able to generate from her. One of the projects that I did for the 75th issue of anniversary of PAR, as I went back, a graduate student and we went back to look at all of the articles that had been published in Public Administration Review, the flagship journal of our field, since its inception. And the first article that I located that I had never, ever heard about was written by Frances Harriet Williams, and it was entitled Minority Groups and the OPA. And so this was a real jewel. And I went and I asked people, do you know Frances? Did you know anything about Frances Harriet Williams? No, no, no. And so one of the things I tried to do in my scholarship was to bring her to life more. So she had the first article in Public Administration Review, Minority Groups in the OPA. The OPA was actually the Office of Price Administration. It doesn't exist now, but it was a federal agency that was in place after World War II, and the focus was on stabilizing prices in goods after World War II. So you may have thought about the stabilization and have read about, sugar and butter, but it was much broader than that. It was also gasoline and tires and bicycles. It was a whole range of items. But Frances Harriet Williams asked, and this is the social equity question that was first asked in PAR in 1947, to what degree were these programs impartially administered? So she looked at the minority groups in the United States at the time and wanted to know to what extent the programs that they were administering were how they were going to impact racial groups of the day. And so that's the first time we see in public administration in writing in our flagship journal, the equity question being asked. The second question, and now we look at this roughly the 1960s, the 1970s, is who is we? When we think about we the people, who is we? And I think that was really the guiding question of the 1960s and the 1970s. And so here is where normally we start the narrative of the scholarship around social equity and public administration. You see the picture here of the beautiful Meadowbrook Conference Center at Syracuse. And this is where the first Meadowbrook Conference was held in 1968, convened by Dwight Waldo, and George Frederickson was there. And, really the idea to be able to, Meadowbrook was supposed to be the sciaticas of public administration. You convene every 20 years and you ask, what are the grand questions of the day and how will the field address them? And so this is where the attendees like George Frederickson begin to think about, what is public administration's role here? We've got civil unrest that's happening. We've got civil rights that's going on. We're sitting here at the Meadowbrook Conference and we're talking about, age-old items, politics, administration, dichotomy. But they felt compelled to say, but what's going on right outside these walls? And how is public administration a part of this? And so here we also see Rawls' theory, where, we think about the veil of ignorance, which is quoted in just about every social equity article as the theoretical guide. How do we put on that veil of ignorance and make decisions that are not in the best interest of any particular group, but are in the best interest of the collective? And how are we motivated to do so? So they largely viewed Meadowbrook as an extension of civil rights and its role therein. One of the things that happened at Meadowbrook was the introduction of new public administration. And new public administration was about having a constellation of values, that public administration was not value neutral, but had essential values. And one of those values was equity. One of those values was social equity. And so that's where we see the emergence from Frederickson, both conceptually and theoretically. Frederickson also had sort of a partner in crime in Phil Rutledge. And Phil Rutledge was also he was a practitioner, had worked in the President Johnson administration, and also was on the faculty at Indiana. But one of the things that Phil Rutledge did was he asked Dwight Waldo to do a PAR symposium. And so we had the first PAR symposium on social equity in 1974, but that was at the request of Phil Rutledge. And so that's where you see the first constellation of articles looking at social equity. What is the concept? Because before, when you looked at the articles in PAR before then, we started, the words equity and equality might have been used, but they weren't defined, they weren't nuanced. And so now we see in the 1974 symposium, we see more nuanced terms where you're differentiating equity and equality. And so equality being about sameness and things that we're all entitled to, whereas equity, it may be about differences, recognizing that different groups need different interventions. But also in the who is the we. So that who is the we included, of course, those who were not included, African Americans, women. It was a much broader inclusion here in public administration. But who is the we also included public administration associations like ASPA, like NASPA. Thinking about public administration associations and their role. NASPA came a bit later as it evolved out of ASPA. Universities being part of the we, faculty and students being part of the we. So this is when it becomes that we indeed, as part of public administration, are part of the social equity equation. The third question that I posed from the literature is how much inequity exists. So we march forward into the 1980s and 1990s, and the concept of social equity is out there. So us being good social scientists in the field, we've got to measure it, right? So we've got to figure out how much social equity actually exists. So here we get the APAM crowd joining on the scene. We get economists and public policy folks. We can measure social inequity and we can get rich data there. But we also, not just from a quantitative sense, we get Deborah Stone's wonderful work, The Public Policy Paradox. And in it, she has a chapter on equity where she looks at the chocolate cake and she says, how do we divide up this chocolate cake? And what's the best way to do it? And of course, the first thing is, well, one slice per person is a chocolate cake, right? That's how we do it. And then you start thinking, well, some people might be hungry and they haven't eaten in a while. So maybe they get a bigger piece, or someone may have allergies to chocolate or to flour. And so they don't need any at all because it would actually be harmful if we give them a chocolate cake. Or maybe we do it by ranks where the chancellor gets the biggest piece and it goes down from there, right? So how do we, measure, how do we think about, how do we conceptualize dividing up resources that we have in society? We have a finite amount of resources. How do we divide them up? It was also then that we came up with the concept of representative bureaucracy. And then we had folks like Greg Lewis who did just phenomenal work counting how many women do we have in government, in federal government, how many African Americans, how many Latinos, how many Asians. I mean, he really advanced our work and understanding in terms of quantifying how representative at the federal level, because the idea was with representative bureaucracy, if we are representative in government, then that representation will then usher in social equity, because you'll have people there who will be interested in looking out for their respective communities. We also began to have more methodological sophistication. So we began to say regression analysis is great, but it doesn't quite get us there. And so in particular, work in the field of social equity was advanced by audit studies. And a lot of these came out of HUD, but also through Johnny Yinger's work at Syracuse University, where we were getting paired testers. And we said, let's get Black, white, Latino couples, have them go and try to get an apartment, or have them go and try to get a loan from a financial institution. And we give them the same packets, and what happens? And so we find that they have vastly different outcomes, even though we have paired testing. They got the exact same documentation. They're getting quoted different interest rates. They're getting quoted different opportunities to rent properties. And so that paired testing really advanced the field of equity, because the challenge in equity work has always been being able to isolate the role of discrimination, whether it's gender discrimination or racial discrimination, discrimination by ability. And the bar is set quite higher when you're having to methodologically, a lot of studies, you can do your regression analysis, and then we can say, hey, what's left over is not explained. But the reviewers always would come back with, well, did you look at this? Did you look at that? I mean, you could never get enough variables to satisfy oftentimes the proof for discrimination. The bar gets higher and higher and higher. And so these audit studies were a way to try to isolate the role of discrimination. And I think we owe a lot to the work that the research did to advance our knowledge and understanding here. And what we began to see as a very pervasive pattern of inequities by race, by gender, by income. So it's not random. And so you could look at inequities in education and how they impact inequities in employment and education and the criminal justice system and housing and the environment and health. And so what we really came up with is there's a saturation of racial inequities, because even though a researcher might be a health researcher and concerned about health policy, people don't live their lives that way. They live their lives not just in the health arena, but it's connected by environment and education. And so what we have then is predictable outcomes where these patterns hold regardless of the sector. And there's not a random assignment or a random distribution. We don't have whites at the top of the ladder, say, for educational achievement, but blacks at the top of the ladder for housing opportunities or employment. These same patterns continue to hold time and again. And so that becomes troubling to have that saturation of racial inequity that we were able to, thanks to much of the scholarship in the 80s and 90s, really get a sense of how much. Now, the problem is you can get stuck there in the measurement piece. And so in the 2000s to the 2010s, I think the question we began to ask as a field is, why does social equity persist? So we have this data and we keep doing it over and over again. One of the articles I wrote, I called it Ready, Aim, Study More. So you get the data and you find the patterns, and we look at the recommendations and the intervention, and then time passes and people say, well, I think we need more data. And so we keep in this cycle. Ready, aim, study more instead of ready, aim, fire. Let's look at the solutions. Let's resolve these inequities. Let's move the needle. And so trying to understand why social equities persisted. And here the work of the National Academy of Public Administration and the Standing Panel on Social Equity in Government really came to the fore. And so here the National Academy. So for those of you who are not as familiar with the National Academy is comprised of elected fellows, and we have several here in the room, and it's practitioners, it's academics, but it's really the most conservative of public affairs associations, more conservative than ASPA, NASPA, or APAM. And so again, Phil Rutledge, comes back on the scene. He's still working. He's done his work with, getting the PAR symposium. But of course, Phil and George were never satisfied. They should never have been satisfied. They said, we've got to keep doing this social equity work. And so they were both Academy Fellows. And under Phil's leadership, the Academy developed the Standing Panel on Social Equity. And the Standing Panel declared that equity was the fourth E in public administration. So we already had equity, effectiveness, efficiency, economy. Now the fourth E is going to be equity. Well, that was huge in terms of public administration, because immediately it legitimized and put equity work in the mainstream scholarship. So before it's like, okay, you're doing kind of this equity stuff off to the side, but now equity then has taken its place alongside the other three E's. And that was huge. And then the standing panel also adopted a definition of social equity that continues to be the most dominant definition of social equity, and also to differentiate the various types of equity, whether we're talking about procedural equity or distributional equity, so how are resources distributed, or process equity, or the most controversial, outcome equity, so that groups have equal outcomes. So a lot of this work just continued to push, and then we saw the graduate curriculum beginning to see within public affairs programs us collectively, integrating equity into our syllabi, into our curriculum, beginning to have concentrations in this area. And so we began to see this work and the importance of this work. So the fifth question then is, how is accountability for social equity achieved? And this was a dominant question from the 2010s to the 2020s. And it's like, okay, we've got this data. Now, how are we going to build in accountability? We cannot just have inequities continue to persist, but we have to have accountability for resolving them. So what's the role of public administrators in not just identifying equity, but in actually solving some of the equity issues and closing the gaps? And here we began to see, I think, just some fascinating work where we began to measure the performance, beginning to identify performance measures of social equity. And early in those days, Sam Lawson was one of the graduate students that got some funding from the National Academy to help identify in the early days performance measures for social equity, because we have performance measures in other areas, but not in terms of equity. How do we move that? And really understanding that it was fundamental to examine the impact of structural inequity and to make sure that we've got interventions. So some of the interventions included like John Powell's work in targeted universalism, where it's not everybody gets the same thing, but within a particular segment, you may have more of a policy or more of a benefit depending upon what the greatest need is. He talks about, I think it's a great example, everybody doesn't wear glasses, right? Because if I don't need glasses and I wear glasses, it's actually making my vision worse, right? So why are we distributing glasses to everyone, right? But for someone who needs glasses, then that's what they need in order to be able to see. So really thinking about how we can use targeted universalism and identify structural inequities, that the problem was not outside of government, because a lot of our equity work in the beginning, the problem was out there in the community. How can we help the community? The Seattle Race and Social Justice Initiative came on the scene in 2004, just absolutely Herculean in terms of really making a difference relative to practitioners and at the local level. And one of the tenets of the Race and Social Justice Initiative in Seattle was to end institutional racism in government. It was there, it was right there on their website. When I wrote my book, Race and Social Equity, a Nervous Area of Government, that was referenced before, I did extensive interviews. I was just fascinated by the city of Seattle and the work that they had done. And I interviewed Mayor Nichols at the time, who said, the motivation for this work was living in a city with a very short radius, and recognizing that within a 10-mile radius, you can have very different educational outcomes. And how is this possible? And so really thinking about the role of government in terms of ending institutional racism in government. Well, that's a heavy statement, because the attorneys there were thinking, well, if you say that there's institutional racism in government, you've admitted us. And then how in the world will we ever win that suit? And so really just thinking about how in the world do we reconcile institutional racism and the role that government agencies have played? Because all government agencies have records, whether it's the EPA. When we think about our society, oftentimes we were a cradle to grave segregated society, especially in the South. And those institutions were governmental institutions. And so understanding the record of those institutions were important. That was important. And that gets us to the nervous area of government. We've got this historical context and we want to do something, but then we have fear because, race and equity and gender, these are topics that, don't give us the warm and fuzzies. And so we have to think about how do we advance that work? And usually it's along 4 core dimensions. It's either advanced politically, there's a political motivator, there's a legal motivator, there's an economic motivator, or a moral motivator, or a combination therein. So we begin to understand more the complexity of social equity and the complex sales that the complex wins that impact the sales of social equity. We also see this work expanded on a global level, looking at the United Nations and the Sustainable Development Goals that are squarely centered in equity. And these are very laudable goals, like end poverty. That's a huge goal right there, right? So, let's set the bar high. But we're beginning to see then how equity is not just context dependent. We've got local governments in this space, state governments in this space, academia in this space. It's just an all push forward. The My Brother Keepers initiative under the Obama administration for men of color. It was really, how is accountability for social equity achieved? How do we put in annual reviews of leaders and managers, presidents and CEOs? How do we evaluate them in terms of equity, just like we would do in the area of finance or management? And so how do we build those things in? So those things began to get built in so that there was more accountability. And so where are we today, and where do I think we're going? Here, I think the dominant question for the future of social equity is, how is social equity advanced? So let's start by talking about the elephant in the room. I don't usually shy away from those topics, and that's the political context, right? And so, when we look around now, a lot of folks, we look in higher education, folks are like, I don't know, I'm really, this is kind of the nervous area of government playing out in higher ed. We had all these initiatives. We had chief diversity officers. We know the landscape, affirmative action, the Supreme Court ruling, what does the future hold? It does not look really good. But I think we have to really delve into the political context. And I am optimistic tonight. I don't think that things are quite as bad as we may be led to believe. So first I'll say, let's back up a bit to 2020, the beginning of 2020 with COVID. We had in our society the most direct application of Rawls' theory of the veil of ignorance, because we did not know in the beginning how COVID was spread, who was going to get it. We just knew that we were all seeing these images and people were dying, body bags were stacking up. What is going on? We had policies that people had been trying to get passed for years and years and years, like telehealth, to make healthcare more accessible, like shorter incarceration rates for those who didn't need to, serve 20, 30 years for a particular sentence. We had, being able to drive by and pick up groceries so that, or have things delivered so that they're more accessible to those who don't have the ability to do those things. And so you began to see so many public policies and policies change just overnight that really ushered in an era of equity for many things that people had been trying to do for years and years and years. And look at how quickly it happened. It happened quickly because there was truly a veil of ignorance. And I think that brought out the best in us as a society to say, I don't know, the best way to protect myself is to protect my neighbor. And, just thinking about the policies that changed in such a short time period, I think is very encouraging. We had the unfortunate murder of George Floyd and others, where we thought about, what does it mean in the criminal justice system and how are individuals being treated? And so we began to see many social equity advances. We saw Confederate statues and monuments coming down in Richmond, Monument Avenue. The monuments came down, the glorification to Confederates and for the principles that they served in relative to racism, just dismantling. That was only 4 years ago. I know it seems like a lifetime ago, but I thought it might be good to remind all of us tonight that that was in our lifetime. That was 4 years, only 4 years ago. So the other thing that I think has happened is, when we think back to COVID, we were trying to save as many lives as possible, as quickly as possible. And I had the most challenging and then the most rewarding part of my academic career when I got a call. I was in my office one day and I got a call from the Northam administration. Janice Underwood, who was our Governor Northam was the governor of Virginia at the time. And Janice Underwood was our first diversity, equity, and inclusion officer. And she called me and she said, this is when we were thinking about the vaccinations and the vaccines were coming. And she said, we want to work with you in the Wilder School to help us develop within Virginia what is going to be our vaccination equity rollout, because of course we didn't have vaccines for everybody. And I was very, in my entire career, it was very humbling because it was the first time I was really working on something that was directly related to life or death in the moment. We assembled a team. I look back now, I mean, most of our meetings were after 5 o'clock, standing meetings on Tuesdays and Fridays. And we were, we had lots of great data and we were doing data-driven work. And we said, okay, we were trying to get relative rates of vaccination to be comparable to the relative rates of infection, which Jade Berry James, who was on our team, came up with that scheme from her epidemiology work. And so, we knew, for example, that those that were in long-term care facilities and the elderly needed to be vaccinated first. Why? Because they were dying quicker. They were in more congregated settings. They had weaker immune systems. Those who were elderly, those who were frontline workers. So we put up all the data. And so we also found that individuals, Black and Brown, African Americans and Latinos in particular, were also being disproportionately hospitalized and dying from COVID. So we said, they need to go to the top of the list. And so folks, hold on a minute, pump the brakes a little bit. And so we said, we're following the data. We're data driven, right? And they were like, yeah, we got it for the old, the elderly, understand the frontline workers, but I'm just, I'm a little uncomfortable, so there we are. We're riding right there in the eye of the storm of the nervous area of government. And so we said, well, help us to understand why we wouldn't follow it. Because if we're being data driven, and this is where the data is driving us, why then would we not do that? And so they thought about it and they reflected on it. And then they came back and they said, yes, we will factor this into our plan as well. And so that was a really pivotal moment in really being able to say, hey, data-driven work, let's look at race like we would look at anything else. Let's follow the data. Let's see where it goes. And it was a very rewarding time. I was sharing last night when I was in my car and I'm a resident of Henrico County. We get this newsletter out and it talked about vaccination prioritization. And they had listed all the groups and they listed African Americans and Latinos in the group. And so I thought that was a real way for us to work through that nervous area in an empirical and data-driven way, again, to save as many lives as possible in society. So when I think now, I look at, we have multiple sectorial actors and leaders. What do I mean by that? We are in a great position relative to, it's not just government that does that work, but we have PA partners. Look at philanthropy and the amount of money that has been given to social equity in the recent years. It is huge. It is huge. Our philanthropic partners have really stepped up to the plate. You've got a lot of foundations that have, put in a lot of money, for example, to funding historically Black colleges and universities, state universities who have been woefully underfunded. And philanthropic organizations have been standing in to try to continue this work. We think about work that is still ongoing at the state and the local level. And yes, for sure, there have been setbacks. But I think one of the things that has happened is that we've also identified that support for social equity is kind of nuanced. And I always tell people, social equity is not a Republican issue, it's not a Democratic issue, it's not a partisan issue. One of the best pieces of social equity legislation was the Americans with Disabilities Act, which we got from President Bush, a Republican. And so when I think about equity work now, so it may be that, when we think about racial equity or LGBTQIA equity, which is, sort of at the back of the line right now, but what's at the front of the line? At the front of the line, we see equity for veterans. That's a good thing. At the front of the line, we see equity for those who have disabilities. That's a great thing. So one of the things that we have to make sure that we're not doing in the social equity community is making sure that we're not missing that there are large parts of social equity populations that perhaps have not been at the fore of our work the way that other areas have been. And so this is an opportunity. So let's get behind, we're for equity. We're for equity for all. Equity for all means equity for all. And so let's get behind, let's support these equity measures for other populations that have been minimalized in the early days of social equity work. I also think that some of the pushback is that we've got to re-examine what I call the A grade. Social equity work is no longer A for effort. We went through a time where we need these plans. Nothing wrong with diversity, equity, and inclusion plans, but the plans are not an end to themselves. And I think one of the things that has been a rightful criticism is asking, what is the return on investment? For every dollar that has been invested, what has been that return on investment? And so this is not, equity issues, not something we can just throw money at and expect to then disavow ourselves of any other responsibility. We've developed these positions. We have thrown money here. Are we getting the results? It's not A for effort, it's A for outcomes. And so I think where we're able to show that those outcomes are moving the needle in whatever those priority areas are, I think our work stands a better chance of being supported and continuing. And then I call this understanding the trees. So, I've heard from my colleagues in public administration, well, I just think folks in our field are backing away from social equity. I'm concerned that, folks are not putting it up at the front the way it was a few years ago, or, what do we do about that? And I say within the profession of public administration and maybe other professions as well, but talk about public administration since that's the one I know best. I think we need to think about people as trees. We've got evergreens. When we think about evergreens, their foliage remains green throughout the season, and they're functional throughout the year. Those are the social equity leaders in the field, whether they're in academia, whether they're politicians, whether they are policymakers. They're on the front line. They're committed to the social equity work, and they're going to continue that work in season and out of season. They have an important role because they drive the vision for social equity, the commitment, and most importantly, our strategy. But then we've got our deciduous trees. They're more seasonal. They shed their leaves. And so, their deciduous trees don't stay green year round. But they're still, maple trees still have value. Oak trees still have value. So for folks in our public administration field who have said, I'm with public administration when it's in, I'm with social equity more when it's in season, not so much when it's out season. Don't worry, they'll be back. When the season changes, they'll come back. The good thing is they're there. They're there and they're ready to be deployed. Okay. And so they are still there and they will be back. They respond to, just like deciduous trees, they respond to external factors such as temperature. And so the water has gotten a little too hot and a little too warm. But I think we need, as long as they're not dead trees, then we're okay. So social equity is here to stay. I'm convinced of that. The E is not going anywhere. The E is still there. It might look a little different than what it has looked like 10 years ago, but there are still opportunity. There's still opportunities there. And we who are committed to that work, we need to think about whatever the political climate is, how do we make the most of the opportunity that is there before us? And how do we continue to make advances in that area? One of the areas I wanted to note that I think they've done a great job in this regard is Achieving the Dream. Achieving the Dream is really focused their work on community colleges. They've been around since 2004, and I had the fortune of being involved in the evaluation team and the launching of their work. And you see their vision. Our vision is for every college to be a catalyst for equitable, anti-racist, and economically vibrant communities. They were funded largely by the Lumina Foundation and other foundations as well. Lumina has given over $250 million to Achieving the Dream since 2004. But what Lumina did, which was different, and they've had outstanding results, and they have really changed a lot of the things that we think about in higher education now, like student success and wanting all students to be successful, start what they finish, what are gatekeeper courses. All of that language came out of the Achieving the Dream initiative because they were committed. But what Lumina also did is they stayed involved and they stayed engaged in the work. And they held community colleges accountable for outcomes. These were resources that were deployed, but again, they had that big accountability piece. So we have to have that accountability piece in order to move the needle. So in conclusion, I would say that the quest to shorten the distance between the principle of equality and the performance of social equity is a continuous one, and we are continuing on that journey. And as our honoree in the inaugural leader for our lecture tonight, Mary Ellen Guy says, before it dangles the promise of a fair and just society. And so that promise continues for us. I would be remiss if I didn't say, of course, we have a big election coming up. And voting in that election is really, really important. And for those of us who care about social equity, this is an opportunity. One of the things that a state senator, Henry Marsh, told me a long time ago, he said, politicians don't lead, they follow. And I think we have to keep that in mind. Look at some of the things of reproductive rights in the dialing back. When people began to feel like seats might be lost, then positions began to change. And we have to keep that in mind, that we are truly the people. We are the leaders in social equity. We are the people in the Constitution. So we have to remember that we're the leaders, not our politicians. And so I just like to end. This is one of my favorite pictures of Barbara Jordan. And Barbara Jordan, I think, gives us the light to continue our work. And she said, what the people want is very simple. They want an America as good as its promise. Thank you very much.
Nicole, do we have some questions written down? That was brilliant. Thank you so much. You set such a high bar for our Mary Guy lecture series. And start with a few questions if you're. Absolutely. Well, we can share the mic.
Oh, are you? I can just use it from here. That's fine. Okay.
Yeah, it's just for our online people. I was
okay.
Want to make sure they. So for students of public administration, what skills should they develop to help build social equity leadership and improve our government and social institutions, how they tackle social issues?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, quite an array. Obviously, the methodological skills are important because even if you're not doing the methodology, you need to be a savvy consumer of research. And so that's one of the things oftentimes, particularly, I'll say this particularly for master's students, because you're going to be in the position of leading and managing. And a lot of people are going to give you data and they're going to tell you what the data is saying. But you have to be able to go back and look at that data and make sure that it's nuanced and is parsed, and making sure that the data is telling you what the message is that you're getting ready to hear. So one example will be, I often talked about the category of white and non-white, and non-white being a proxy for almost everything, every other group. And I said, but we have to understand who are the non-white individuals in this particular survey, because are the non-whites African Americans? Are the non-whites American Indians, Latinos, Asians? Who are the non-whites? So if you're telling me that, we're seeing differences in whites versus non-whites, I need to know who is in this group. So being a savvy consumer of research and research methods, that's always important. I also think, it's really, really important to have strong budget and financial management skills. I tell everyone, if you really want to know what any individual or any organization values, you only need to look at two things. You need to look at how they spend their time and how they spend their money. That tells you what they really, really value. So I can tell you, all day, every day, I value fitness and all that. But if you look at my time and my money and I'm never going to the gym, it's great. It's great talk, but the walk is not there. And so, examining that in organizations to say, how are we, if we're committed to these principles, how is that reflective in our financial statement, in our financial spending patterns? So that's important as well. I also think it's really important to have political savviness. We do operate in a political environment. And I know oftentimes, folks say, well, I don't want to get into the politics of it. Well, I will tell you then, I don't know where you're going to go in society, because everything has a political dimension. It can be a professional association. It can be a civic organization. Everything has a political dimension. But you have to think through, how are you able to understand the political environment that you're in and how you can advance and what are the opportunities? Every political environment has opportunities, and we have to understand and be savvy in terms of developing strategies to help realize those goals.
Thank you. The next question is I'll jokingly say a small one, but what are your thoughts on social equity in a global multinational world?
Mm-hmm. Oh, well, just such a small question, right? It's interesting. I've been doing, more work in this area, and I think this is an area ripe for scholarship. I mean, one of the things that I think we don't really realize is the equity lens in the continuum. Really, when you start going to other places in the world, you really see the stark differences. You go to quote unquote developing nations, and you really see equity in terms of just access to clean water, access to education. I mean, let's think about Afghanistan now, and what opportunities are there for females in terms of education. I mean, the landscape has just changed and shifted right under the foot. So I do think that the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, I think they do provide a useful framework. One of the things that I think is really important, and I don't mean to go on too long, but I don't know if folks have looked at Freedom House data. Freedom House data looks to see how democratic organizations, how democratic countries are. And so oftentimes we've talked about, well, we think, nations are becoming, the United States included, less democratic. Well, what does that mean? Well, democratic characteristics have indeed declined around the globe, but authoritarianism is increasing. That's what's increasing. And so the Freedom House, they do criteria. They have these different criteria looking at, ease of voting, but a lot of a constellation of values, and they come out with these scores. And so even nations that are considered, there's just three categories: free, partially free, and not free. And we're seeing the scores slip. So even though the United States is still in the free category, there are many countries like Norway, Finland, Sweden, who are far more free than the United States. I think we need to pay careful attention to that data because, the decline in democracy around the globe, and the other side of that coin, the rise of authoritarianism, that is something that we should be concerning to all of us.
So a question about the opioid crisis, which maybe hits a lot of parts of society, but maybe hits rural areas and some of the
Right.
groups that we might not have thought of in terms of social equity. How can those in power best approach this in a social equity lens when maybe some of the money runs out that's there now from the settlements and those kinds of things?
So again, I think I think that's a great example of an equity opportunity, right? In terms of the opioid crisis and dealing with those issues. And then you mentioned in that rule, and I'll say that from an equity standpoint, that has been another area of opportunity that was ushered in by the pandemic. Recognizing how the need for broadband, and now there's bipartisan support for broadband in rural America, which a lot of folks in rural America were screaming and shouting, "Hey, what about us? We need better broadband. We need better access." So that's been another equity opportunity for individuals who live in rural communities. The opioid crisis and the funding that is tied to that is, at the end of the day, is no different than anything else, right? Like what happens when the health equity money dries up, or we take advantage and we try to do as much as we can with the funds that are there. We hope that if financial funding from government organizations dry up, that hopefully our philanthropic partners will help to stand in the gap, but that we continue. We just have to run as fast as we can with the resources that we have.
Thanks for taking all these questions so quickly.
Sure.
A lot of them are very big. Another one from someone on Zoom is how you mentioned earlier the pushback against DEI and various things happening in states and higher education. How can advocates and policy practitioners most effectively counter these challenges in their work, including the recent Supreme Court case to deal with affirmative action?
Mm-hmm. Well, here's what I think. I've been asked a lot about the affirmative action case. First of all, we got to look at the data. And I'll go on record. I certainly support affirmative action. I think that the history is there in terms of the rationale. And I think when we're thinking about the outcomes, that's important. However, I think the presence or the absence of affirmative action wasn't the only factor toward opportunity and getting an A in terms of equity, in terms of our outcomes. So if we look like MIT, for example, we have had a significant decline in terms of Black and brown students at MIT, but it has not been the case at Yale. So, there's a mixed record here. Duke University, actually, they're doing better in terms of recruiting students of color. So I think it goes to the fact that, it's not just about legislation. It's not just about policy. It's about intent. It's about leadership. For those who are committed to doing social equity work from a leadership perspective, that work will continue because there are so many things that universities can still do. There's no limit on where you can recruit from. Not at all. You can recruit from anywhere that you want to recruit. And so how do we build and have scholarships available? How do we dedicate resources? It really is about intent and that intentionality. I've always long thought that on the DEI front, there were two types of DEI officers. There were those DEI officers that were really engaged in the work and really trying to move the needle. And then there were DEI officers at institutions that were designed really to protect the institution from moving forward. They were symbolic, really, in their efforts, but they were hired into the position really knowing there's not a real commitment to DEI at this university. And what we want to make sure that you do is that, you basically keep it that way. And so I think we have to really be honest and not look at this in a very simple fashion that, DEI positions solve everything or affirmative action was the silver bullet. For those organizations who want to continue to do that work will continue and that data will continue to trend in a positive direction. For those who are not, I think we have to ask the question, really, was the intent ever there?
Thank you. So we're running a little short on time, and I'll use the dean's prerogative to ask my fellow dean the final question. As I was thinking as I watched your excellent presentation of the history of this approach in the U.S. And it's kind of, I don't know, to paraphrase Martin Luther King, the arc seems to be bending towards social equity over time, but there's always pushback, right, in all of those. And you didn't emphasize a lot of that. And we know right now we're in a pushback phase. Sure. And I don't know, more and more I think about politics as often a pendulum or something. Like it's not, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And, all of these progress that you chronicled in social equity has also come with some pushback.
Yes, absolutely.
And that builds up over time. But how do you think about that? The kind of the linear progression of these ideas and the pushback against them? Is it?
Well, what does that song say? I beg your pardon. I never promised you a rose garden, right? We never had a rose garden for social equity, right? There's going to be pushback. There's going to, we think about the concept of social equity as like our lives, right? There are things that we have setbacks from time to time. And so, yes, this is a time now that we don't have, well, it depends on the level. I mean, the Biden administration, I think, has done a lot relative to racial equity in their executive orders. And I think that gets lost sometimes because we're focused so much on what is happening at the state level. But the federal government is still moving under the Biden administration very positively. You could go on the website and look at, some of the accomplishments and judge them for yourself. But that work has been ongoing. So yes, social equity at this point it may not have the same level of enthusiasm and support across the board, but I think that's also a good sign because that tells us what? It tells us that the things that we were doing were impactful to the point now that social equity has become a threat. You're not a threat if you're not making an impact. So the fact that social equity, that there's been pushback says to me that this work was on the right track, that this work was actually making a difference. And so, as I said, I'm a firm believer in that these things are seasonal. And I think back to, where would we be if we, if folks in the 1960s had given up, where would we be today? We can't give up. We have to keep doing this work in season and out season. So be an evergreen tree.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Susan. That was excellent.
Thank you.